In this lesson, let's talk about some basic terminology used in CSS. Probably one of the first things you should learn about styling in CSS are classes. A class is used to target one or multiple elements that share the same properties and to style those elements in CSS. If you're familiar with Illustrator or InDesign, it is something similar to character or paragraph styles, but it can be applied to any element, not just the text. A class is called out with a dot, and it shouldn't contain spaces. It can have any name you want, but it shouldn't have any spaces. Here you can see an example of a web page that I've built using some classes. For example, we can have a H4, which is basically a heading of the 4th level. And this H4 class is applied to Apple Did You Know Good for Rich in Titles. And basically what it means and how it works is that if I go to my CSS and change the styling of this class, it will automatically apply this styling and these changes to all these headings and all this text that belongs to this class. I can also have the class called body copy. In my case, I have 2 paragraphs that are basically styled with the class body copy. Or I can have the class called labels. Let's say that I decide that I don't want these labels to have a white background anymore, or I want them to be a little bit bigger or smaller. I can simply go into my CSS, change the values and the styling of the class labels, and it will automatically apply those changes and change the appearance of all these elements that belong to this class throughout my whole website. Now there is something called IDs as well. The difference is that a class can be used for multiple elements on the website, and one element can have multiple classes, but it can only have one ID. So basically IDs are used for unique elements with unique properties. If you have multiple elements that share the same properties, use a class. If you have a unique element with unique properties, use an ID. IDs are very useful for variations of the same class, and they are called out with a hashtag. A class is called with a dot, ID is called with a hashtag. Let's say that I have a button on my website and I apply some global styling. I want all my buttons to have the same size, the same font size, the same spacing around my text, maybe the same rounded edges and so on. But at the same time, I want some buttons to have a different color. So for example, I can have a pink button and I can apply a global button class to this, which will basically transfer all these global properties of that button, but at the same time I can give it additionally an ID called pink, and I can assign a color, a different color to this ID. Or maybe I want to have also a green button, so I would give it a global class called global button and additionally an ID green that will simply give it a different color. Then we have selectors. P stands for paragraphs. That is basically a basic piece of text. And then we have A for links. Anything that links to another page, it is commonly used for buttons, but it can be a piece of text, it can be an image, it can be anything that links to something else. It can be IMG for images. And then we have, as you saw, something called H, H1, H2, H3, and so on. That is a common selector for headings. And we have different levels of headings. H1 is basically the biggest text, but it is not only about the font size. It is also the most important heading that has the most emphasis and that is used for SEO purposes. Then we have H2, which is heading of level 2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. So these are all different levels of headings. We have UL and OL. UL stands for unordered list or a bullet list, and OL stands for ordered list. Basically, these lists where you have numbers like 1, 2, 3 for each list item. Logically, we also have list items, which are called LI selectors. And then we have divs. Now, divs are containers or boxes, and you can literally think of it as a box. And you can put different pieces of content inside. So as you are packing, for example, you can put your books, papers, you can put pencils and so on in your box. You can put different types of content in your divs. You can put only one piece of text, or you can put a text, an image, a link, a list, and so on. So these are basically containers or boxes containing different types of content inside. Before we continue, this video is a part of our online course. CSS Basics, focusing on practice and aimed specifically at beginners without any coding experience and designers. In this course, you will learn the basics of CSS without tech talk through simple language, visual explanations, and short lessons, and a series of interactive, hands-on custom exercises, not just the theory. If you would like to learn more and get access to the full course and the exercises, check the link in the description or just continue watching these videos for free. Now let's get back to the video. We have units, and most commonly we are using pixel units. We will be working with units a little bit more throughout the course, but for now, remember to use pixel units. We also have a percentage. We have EM, REM, something called viewport width and viewport height. Then we have colors. Colors can have different formats, and most commonly we are using hex RGB and RGBA. Hex colors are using basically a hashtag and 6 numbers or letters or the combination of both. And RGB, which maybe you are already familiar with if you are a graphic designer, they use 3 values: red, green, and blue. And we also have something called RGBA. Now, RGBA is basically RGB format, but with added 4th value. And this 4th value controls the transparency and determines the transparency of your color. 1 stands for full opacity and 0 for full transparency, for transparent color. So, for example, if I have a class called pink box, which I'm using for this div, on the right side, you can see how I could define this background color of my div. So I would write RGBA, I would type 3 values, which are basically RGB values for my color, and I would add this 4th value, in my case 0.3, that would determine the transparency of my color. Now don't worry, we are not writing the CSS code yet. This is just to show you how RGBA values work and what the 4th value actually means. And then we have margins and paddings. Now, margins and paddings, they add or remove spacing between elements or within elements. Let's say that I have a few boxes of content here. Margins control the spacing between different elements. It can be horizontal spacing or vertical spacing. So, for example, if I have a class pink box, which is the class of this first container that has the text button text in it, on the right side, you can see that I can define a bottom margin. And let's say it can be 10 pixels, it can be 20 pixels or whatever. And this will basically determine the spacing between this element and the next element that's at the bottom. Now paddings control the inner spacing within the element itself. So this would be basically the spacing between the text and the edge of the button or the edge of the container. And for example, let's put a class pink button on our button. On the right side, you can see how we could determine this spacing or this padding in CSS. Now, how do we define margins and paddings? We use 4 values, and the order of these values is top, right, bottom, and left. So for example, again, let's use our div button text. We are using the class pink button. We are again using a selector A because let's imagine that this is a button, which means that it is a link. And if I call my padding and I use 4 values, the first value determines the top padding or the spacing on the top of my text. Again, remember that we are using padding values, which means that we are determining the spacing within our element. So inside, not outside of the borders. So the first value determines the top padding, the second value determines the right padding, third one is the bottom, and the 4th one is the left. Now what happens if we have a symmetric padding, like in our case? So I don't have to type 4 values, I can only type 2 values. And in this case, the first value refers to top and bottom, and the second value refers to left and right. I can also have all equal paddings on all sides, and in that case I would only use 1 value. Like in this case, 1 value 10 pixels, it means that we have 10 pixels on all sides. And these rules apply to both margins and paddings. Now we have something also called z-index. Z-index defines the stacking order of elements. So it basically means how things are positioned relatively to each other. Let's say that I have a few blocks here, like 2 boxes and a circle, and this bottom box, the red one or the pink one, it has z-index of 1. The next one, which is the circle, it has z-index of 2, and the topmost one has the z-index of 3. This shows you that the higher the number is, that element will be on top of other elements. So z-index 3 is higher than z-index 2. Z-index 2 is higher than z-index 1. That means that the element with the lower z-index will go at the bottom, and the element with the higher one will go on top of it. If we change z-index of our circle, for example, here to 5, it will go on top of both of these elements that have lower z-index than this one. Let's talk about pseudoelements. Now, pseudoelements target a specific part of an element. They start with double colon, and we have different pseudoelements. Some of them we will talk about more during the course. For now, let's just see some examples like marker, before, after, and the first line. Now, marker pseudoelement is used in lists. Let's say that I have an ordered list with a few list items, and that list has a class called sample list. Now, if I target a pseudoelement called marker, and on the right side you can see that I've used double colon and the marker to target this marker, what this will do is that it will apply that styling only to the marker of this list. In my case, the marker is the number of my ordered list. So I can change the color, for example, and it won't touch the remaining part of the list, just the marker. About before and after pseudoelements we will talk more because they're a little bit more complex, but at the same time they allow you to do a lot of different things when you're coding in CSS. But let's now just see an example of the first line pseudoelement. I have a basic paragraph here that has a class called body copy. Now, if I use a first line pseudoelement, like on the right side, you can also see that I can change the color. It can be the font, it can be anything, any property, any value you want. I can change this, the first line pseudoelement, by simply putting double colon, first line, and then changing that property for that first line only. We also have something called pseudoclasses. Now, pseudoclasses target a specific state of an element, not part of an element, but a state of an element. They start with a single colon, and it can be hover, active, focus, and so on. It can be nth child, for example, first child, last child. We will talk more about these during the course. Let's just see quickly how this works. I have a button called, with the class pink button. It has some text. Click here. And on the right side, you can see that I've defined a hover state of this button using a pseudo class, which means that if I put my mouse on it, it will change the background color to something different. And this is commonly used for links, for buttons, using a hover state or hover pseudo class. We also have something called nth childs. For example, I have 3 boxes here with a class called squares. And if I want to change the color of one child, let's say, which can be the first, third, second, it can be fifth, or whichever element within this class, I can simply use nth child, like you can see on the right, and then change the property, and it will apply that change only to that particular element. Now we have display. Display defines the layout and the visibility of items in CSS. It can be block, inline, inline block, or flex. These are the most commonly used displays in CSS. It can also be display none, and basically what it does is that we will talk about it more during the course, but it basically just determines the positioning of the elements. So we can, for example, put them in a horizontal row or vertically in a column and so on. And we also have comments. Comments are extremely important and useful in CSS because they help us navigate in the CSS code. Sometimes you can get lost in all that code, or you need to just find something quickly, and comments are a very useful thing for you and for also other coders that might be looking at your code. They open with a slash and asterisk and close with an asterisk and slash. And those bits of code, let's say, they don't actually get executed. So these are simply the notes or comments that are supposed to help you and your fellow coders when you're designing and building a website. On the right side, you can see how a sample comment can look like.